A fourth area of impact of Stalin's policies on the USSR was in nationality policy. Stalin seems to have had quite a simple approach to the national issue in the Soviet Union. That if there were groups of people who were suspect, if there were people living in areas that looked like they were strategically important and the local people were a bit of a nuisance, then one would just move them. Forcibly resettle them. Now, there are various ways of moving people across countries. One can give them incentives. You can say, if you move to this other area, then we'll give you a nicer house, we'll give you a better paid job, we'll look after your children. This was not the method of the Stalin regime. The method of the Stalin regime was simply to round people up, put them into railway carriages and move them. There were very, very large military operations. At times 20, 30, 40, 100,000 troops could be involved, ensuring that this actually happened. And many people died en route. People were unable to create new lives in different places. So the amount of resentment that was created, the amount of hatred in this system continued well beyond the Stalin period. This was not a happy society. This was not a settled society. This is not a society in which one could plan for one's life and for one's career. A very famous social historian of Stalin's Russia, Moshe Levin, has called it the quicksand society. And this is precisely why the government introduced things like internal passports, why it introduced the criminalization of the theft of state property, because it was an attempt in some way to try and get control of this society. This whirlwind, this social change that had been set aside by collectivization and industrialization, the government no longer had control of it. Hence the passports, hence the permission to live in particular parts of the USSR. Hence the amount of security police in this system. This is a regime that did not feel at ease with itself. So how did it try and give Soviet citizens some sense of coherence, some sense of joy, some sense of what are we and where are we going, some sense of connection to the regime? Here we come to cultural policy. Cultural policy was a way in which the regime tried to convince the citizens that what was happening was a good thing, that they were still all part of one Soviet family. We can notice several things here. First of all, the closing off of Soviet cultural life to external influences. One of the remarkable things about the period of the new economic policy in the 1920s that ran up to the Stalin Revolution was its relative openness, and its openness in particular to Western culture and Western civilization. The fact that movies like Robin Hood were very popular in the Soviet Union, certainly more popular than the products of Soviet culture like the battleship Potemkin. Foreign film stars, Douglas Fairbanks, visited Moscow, drew huge crowds. There was a whole magazine industry around foreign stars in the 1920s. That was no longer possible in the culture of the 1930s. That any culture was to be Soviet and produced by Soviet artists. And a particular important role was given here to cinema. And Stalin had a particular interest in cinema. And the message of cinema should be ideologically sound, but it should also be entertaining. So we see the quite remarkable spectacle of the collective farm musical, or the emphasis given to successful Soviet football teams. But what was an incredibly important part of all of these plots was that somebody from a locality should then become popular and famous in Moscow. And what this demonstrated was the connection between Moscow as the capital of the Soviet Union and all of the periphery. That everybody was in this together. So that in one particular movie about football, a movie called Goalie, this goalkeeper played for the national team, but only made it for the national team when he made the journey all the way back to his local village and played for the local village team. That we are not at civil war, we are not against each other. There is the unity of town and countryside. Alongside this type of propaganda attempt, a cultural attempt to reinforce a sense of unity in this society, we also see some changes from the radicalization of early Soviet cultural policy in terms of certain values. For the Bolsheviks, it was incredibly vital that their society was an atheistic society. That at the centre of man is man. There is no place for God in communism. In Stalin's Russia in the 1930s, we witness what Timoshev and Trotsky and others have called the conservative revolution in values. This was a revolution in which the regime tried to come to some type of accommodation with Russian orthodoxy, with religion. That new opportunities were given for people to worship. There was less persecution of the churches, and this was before the Second World War. There were also changes in family policy. That no longer was abortion to be available for women. That there was to be a pro-family policy in terms of children. Now, one can argue that this was meeting the regime's need for a new generation of workers to work in the factories. But it was also a significant change in trying to make families once again nuclear. That they had a mother, a father, and children. And once you were committed to that, you were discouraged from divorce. Another side of that was the recriminalization of homosexuality. When the old Tsarist criminal code had been done away with in 1917, there had been no new legislation about homosexuals or lesbians. This changed in the 1930s, when once again these were characterised as forms of sexual deviance, to be criminalised and discouraged. Add these three things together, the family policy, the change on sexuality, and the change towards religion, and what people see here is a conservative reaction within the revolution. Now, why? Well, because in this way you can make people feel connected, secure, that we are all part of one family. So you tie that to cultural messages through cinema, through newspapers, through novels, through plays and so on and so forth, then you see the attempt to reintegrate this society. Now, I'm not convinced myself that Stalin succeeded in this. When you read the types of things that citizens would write to newspaper editors anonymously in the 1930s, when you see citizens' letters that have remained in archives, what we see is a citizenry that is not frightened to express itself. It is not afraid to say, this is a regime that does not live up to its own promises. This is a violent regime. This is a regime we wish we were not living under. That I actually witness a very independent-minded people in 1930s Russia. People who retained a sense of critical distance from the regime and all the important events going on around them. And that spirit of independence was kept alive through the 1930s, into the 1940s and into the 1950s. So by the time Stalin dies in 1953, we see these voices very quickly bubble to the top. The voices demanding an end to Stalinism. voices demanding freedom of expression, cultural pluralism. So if Stalin did become society, on Trotsky's argument, if that is true, then it remains true only for a relatively short time in the history of the USSR, and certainly dies along with Stalin himself.